Taylor Swift had always been known for her generosity, her deep connection with fans, and her unwavering appreciation for those who had shaped her life. From surprising fans with handwritten notes to making unexpected donations to those in need, she had a heart as big as her talent. But nothing could have prepared one unsuspecting high school teacher for what would be the surprise of a lifetime. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. Mr. James Thornton had been a dedicated English teacher for over 3 decades at a small town high school in Tennessee. With his gray-streaked hair, round glasses, and warm demeanor, he was the kind of teacher who left a lasting impression. To his students, he wasn't just a teacher. He was a mentor, a storyteller, and at times, even a surrogate father. He had always encouraged his students to dream big, to believe in the power of words, and to chase their passions no matter how unreachable they seemed. One of his most memorable students had been a teenage girl with a notebook full of lyrics and a dream bigger than the town itself. Taylor Swift. She had sat in the front row of his class, hanging onto every lesson about poetry and prose, absorbing every metaphor like it was a secret to the universe. She had shared her lyrics with him timidly at first, uncertain about whether they were any good. Mr. Thornton had read them carefully, nodding thoughtfully before looking up at her and saying, "You have something special here, Taylor. The way you tell a story, it's going to take you far." Years passed. Taylor Swift became a global sensation, a household name, and one of the best-selling artists of all time. She had gone on to win Grammys, sell out stadiums, and write songs that millions of people across the world could relate to. But through it all, she never forgot the teacher who had believed in her when she was just a young girl with a guitar and a dream. One crisp autumn morning, Mr. Thornton arrived at school like any other day, parking his old beat-up sedan in the faculty lot. The car had been with him for over 15 years, breaking down more times than he could count, yet he never had the heart or the funds to replace it. The engine sputtered as he turned the key, and for a moment he thought it might not start at all. With a resigned sigh, he gave the dashboard a reassuring pat and stepped out, briefcase in hand. The day unfolded like any other. He taught his classes with his usual passion, guiding students through Shakespeare's sonnets and Hemingway's prose. The bell rang, signaling the end of the day, and as he gathered his papers, the principal appeared at his door, looking strangely excited. "James, I need you to come outside for a moment," the principal said, barely able to contain his grin. Puzzled, Mr. Thornton followed him down the hall, past rows of curious students whispering amongst themselves. As he stepped out onto the school parking lot, he froze. There, standing beside a gleaming brand new SUV, was Taylor Swift. She looked just as radiant as he remembered, her golden hair shining in the afternoon light, her eyes filled with warmth. But what left him speechless was the expression on her face, pure gratitude. "Mr. Thornton," she said, stepping forward, "you have no idea how much you changed my life." He opened his mouth, but no words came. He was in utter shock. This was Taylor Swift, his former student, the girl who had once nervously read her lyrics to him after class. Taylor smiled, holding out a key. "This is for you." Mr. Thornton blinked, looking between her and the brand new SUV. "What, Taylor? I don't understand." She laughed, the sound bright and full of emotion. "I remember the car you used to drive when I was in high school, and I saw the one you're driving now," she said, gesturing to his old sedan. "I figured it was time for an upgrade." The crowd of students and teachers who had gathered erupted into cheers and gasps, some pulling out their phones to capture the moment. Tears welled in Mr. Thornton's eyes. He had always been the kind of man who gave selflessly, never expecting anything in return. And yet, here stood one of his former students, someone who had gone on to achieve unimaginable success, giving back in a way that left him overwhelmed. "Taylor, this is too much," he said, voice trembling. She shook her head. "No, it's not. You believed in me before anyone else did. You told me my words mattered, that my stories had power, that changed everything for me." Her voice thickened with emotion. "You deserve this." A tear slipped down Mr. Thornton's cheek as he reached out to take the key. He looked at the car, then back at her, shaking his head in disbelief. "Thank you," he whispered. Taylor stepped forward and embraced him, and in that moment, the years melted away. She was no longer the international superstar, just a grateful student hugging the teacher who had changed her life. The moment was one of pure magic. News outlets picked up the story, and within hours it went viral. People from all over the world shared their own stories about teachers who had changed their lives, some reaching out to reconnect with educators they had lost touch with. Mr. Thornton became an overnight symbol of the impact teachers have, a reminder that sometimes a few words of encouragement can change the course of a student's future. But the surprises weren't over yet. Later that evening, Taylor sat down for an interview, where she spoke about the moment and why it meant so much to her. "I've had a lot of people believe in me along the way," she said, "but Mr. Thornton was the first. He saw something in me before anyone else did. He made me feel like my words mattered, and I'll never forget that." Unbeknownst to her, Mr. Thornton was watching from his small living room, tears streaming down his face. That night, he received hundreds of messages from former students, some he hadn't heard from in decades, all thanking him for the impact he had on their lives. But perhaps the most touching moment came the following day. As he walked into school, students lined the halls, clapping and cheering for him. Some held signs that read, "Best teacher ever," and "Thank you, Mr. Thornton." And when he stepped into his classroom, he found a framed note on his desk. It was from Taylor. It read, "You told me my words had power. So do yours." He clutched the note to his chest, overcome with emotion. It was true. His words had mattered. His belief in his students had changed lives. And though he had never sought recognition, that moment reminded him that teaching was more than just a job. It was a legacy. From that day forward, he drove his new SUV with pride, not just because of the generous gift, but because of what it represented. It wasn't about the car. It was about the impact he had made, about the lives he had touched, about the fact that sometimes the smallest acts of encouragement can lead to the biggest dreams coming true. And as Taylor Swift continued to write songs that moved the world, Mr. Thornton continued to teach, knowing that in every classroom sat another dreamer, another student whose words had power waiting for someone to believe in them. Mr. Thornton could barely sleep that night. His heart was too full, his mind too overwhelmed by the whirlwind of emotions. He had spent decades pouring his soul into teaching, never expecting anything in return. And yet here he was, the recipient of one of the grandest gestures of gratitude he had ever imagined. The next morning, as the sun painted the sky in soft hues of pink and gold, he found himself standing in his driveway, staring at the brand new SUV. The sleek black exterior gleamed under the rising sun, a stark contrast to the old rusting sedan that had been his companion for so many years. He ran a hand over the hood, still struggling to believe it was real. The leather seats, the advanced dashboard, the smoothness of the engine, it was more than he had ever dreamed of having. But more than the car itself, it was the sentiment behind it that struck him the hardest. He had taught thousands of students, hoping only to ignite a love for words, to inspire them to think beyond the ordinary. He never knew how far his words would go, how deeply they had touched someone like Taylor Swift. When he arrived at school that morning, something extraordinary happened. Students were already waiting for him in the parking lot. Dozens of them, past and present, gathered together, some holding up handmade signs that read, "Thank you, Mr. Thornton." Others clapped as he stepped out of his car, his face flushing with surprise. "Mr. Thornton, we saw what Taylor did for you," one student called out. "You deserve it more than anyone." The principal stood off to the side, smiling, his arms crossed. "You always said teaching wasn't about recognition," he said warmly, "but it looks like your students wanted to give you some anyway." A lump formed in Mr. Thornton's throat as he took in the faces of his students, some of whom had struggled with confidence, some of whom had once been lost, but had found their way through his class. Every teacher dreams of leaving an impact, of making a difference. And now, he knew for certain that he had. The weeks that followed were a blur of media attention. News outlets from all over the country wanted to interview him, to ask about his relationship with Taylor Swift, to hear his story firsthand. He gave a few interviews, always deflecting the attention back onto teaching as a whole. "This isn't about me," he would say humbly. "This is about the power of teachers, about the power of believing in young minds before they believe in themselves." The attention wasn't something he had ever sought, but it did lead to something wonderful, an outpouring of appreciation for teachers everywhere. Former students across the nation took to social media, sharing stories of educators who had shaped them, who had changed their lives in ways they had never fully expressed before. Hashtags like #ThankYouTeacher and #TeachersMatter began trending, turning into a movement. Inspired by Taylor's act of kindness, people started organizing fundraisers for underpaid teachers, donating school supplies, and pushing for policy changes that would support educators better. It was as if the world had suddenly woken up to the fact that teachers weren't just instructors. They were architects of the future. Amidst all the newfound recognition, Mr. Thornton continued doing what he loved most, teaching. He showed up every day, walked into his classroom, and taught with the same passion he always had. If anything, his experience had only reaffirmed why he had chosen this path in the first place. But then, another surprise came. One afternoon, he received an email that made his heart stop. It was from Taylor Swift's team. They were inviting him to one of her concerts, a VIP experience, complete with backstage access. He hesitated. He wasn't one for grand events or big crowds. But then he thought about how proud he had been of Taylor all those years ago, watching her scribble lyrics in the margins of her notebooks. He had always told her to chase her dreams, to embrace the stage of life fearlessly. And now, she was offering him a front row seat to see what she had built. So he said yes. When the concert day arrived, he found himself in a massive arena, the air electric with excitement. The stage was a dazzling spectacle of lights and music, filled with tens of thousands of fans singing every word to her songs. The sheer scale of it all was overwhelming, and yet, despite the flashing lights and the deafening cheers, Taylor was still the same girl he remembered, the one who poured her soul into every lyric. When the concert ended, a security guard led him backstage, where Taylor was waiting for him. She was still in her stage outfit, her face glistening from the energy of the performance. The moment she saw him, she broke into a grin. "You made it," she said, pulling him into a hug. "I wouldn't miss it for the world," he admitted, taking in the surreal moment. She led him to a quieter room where they could talk. "You know," she said, "I still have that notebook from high school, the one with all my old lyrics." Mr. Thornton chuckled. "And I bet those lyrics turned into some pretty famous songs." She laughed. "Some of them did, and some are just reminders of where I started." She paused, her expression softening. "That's why I wanted you here tonight. I wanted you to see what you helped build." Tears welled in his eyes. It was one thing to know he had impacted a student's life, but to see it so vividly, to witness the empire she had created, the millions she had touched, it was overwhelming. Taylor reached into her bag and pulled out a small, wrapped box. "I have one more thing for you," she said. He unwrapped it carefully, his hands slightly trembling. Inside was a beautifully bound book, the pages thick and luxurious. When he opened it, he realized it was filled with handwritten letters. From students. From former students he hadn't seen in years. Each page contained a letter from someone whose life he had touched, sharing stories of how his words had guided them, how his belief had helped them push forward. "I wanted to give you something that lasts longer than a car," Taylor said softly. "Something that reminds you every single day how much you matter." Mr. Thornton was silent, too overcome to speak. He traced his fingers over the words on the pages, feeling the depth of emotion in each one. "Thank you," he finally whispered. "This means more than I can say." That night, as he drove home in his new SUV, the book resting safely beside him, he thought about the life he had lived. He had never been a wealthy man, never sought fame or recognition. All he had ever wanted was to teach. And now he knew, beyond any doubt, that he had done exactly what he was meant to do. But the story didn't end there. Inspired by the impact his teaching had on so many, Taylor Swift decided to start something even bigger. She announced the Mr. Thornton Scholarship Fund, a foundation dedicated to providing financial support for students pursuing careers in education. She spoke openly about the importance of teachers, about how they were often underappreciated despite shaping the world's future. She pledged a significant portion of the fund from her own earnings, encouraging others to donate and support the cause. When Mr. Thornton heard the news, he was overwhelmed all over again. The fund went on to help thousands of students who dreamed of becoming teachers but lacked the means to do so. Young men and women across the country pursued education degrees inspired by the story of one high school teacher who had unknowingly changed the course of history. Years later, as Mr. Thornton finally retired, he left behind not just a legacy within his own classroom, but an entire generation of educators who had been uplifted by his story. At his retirement ceremony, former students gathered, some flying in from different parts of the world just to thank him. And as he stood there looking out at the sea of faces, he knew with absolute certainty this was the greatest reward any teacher could ever receive. And somewhere in the front row of the audience sat Taylor Swift, smiling through tears, knowing that her simple act of gratitude had turned into something far bigger than she had ever imagined. The weeks that followed Mr. Thornton's retirement were filled with reflection. For the first time in decades, he didn't wake up before dawn to prepare lesson plans, didn't stand in front of a classroom filled with eager, or sometimes reluctant, students. The rhythm of his life had shifted, and while he welcomed the well-earned rest, there was an undeniable ache in his heart. Teaching had been his purpose for so long. Without it, he felt untethered. But then, something extraordinary happened. One evening, as he sat on his porch sipping tea and watching the sunset, his phone rang. It was an unknown number, but something compelled him to answer. "Mr. Thornton?" came a warm, familiar voice. It was Taylor. He smiled, pleasantly surprised. "Taylor, my dear, how are you?" "I'm great," she said. "But more importantly, how are you? Retirement treating you well?" He chuckled. "It's an adjustment." There was a pause on the line, and then Taylor said something that made his heart skip a beat. "I have an idea, and I need you to be a part of it." Taylor explained that, after launching the Mr. Thornton Scholarship Fund, she had been thinking about how else she could support education. The overwhelming response from former students, educators, and even fans had made her realize that people wanted to do more than just donate. They wanted to engage, to contribute to the future of teaching in a meaningful way. "I want to start an education initiative," she said, "a foundation that not only funds future teachers but also provides resources, mentorship, and workshops for educators across the country." She hesitated before adding, "And I want you to help me build it." Mr. Thornton was speechless. "Taylor, I don't know the first thing about running a foundation, but you know everything about teaching," she countered. "You know what teachers need, what students need. I don't want a business person running this. I want you. I need you." His mind raced. Retirement had given him peace, but it had also left a void, and here was an opportunity to continue making an impact, on an even bigger scale than he ever imagined. He took a deep breath, his heart pounding with excitement. "All right," he said, "I'm in." Within months, the Thornton Swift Education Initiative was born. The foundation aimed to provide support for teachers in underserved communities, offering grants for classroom supplies, professional development, and student resources. It also created a mentorship program, pairing experienced teachers with young educators just starting their journey. The initiative quickly gained traction. Taylor used her platform to bring awareness, rallying her millions of followers to support the cause. Celebrities, philanthropists, and education advocates joined the movement, making it one of the most significant education initiatives in recent years. But perhaps the most groundbreaking aspect was the Thornton Fellowship, a program that selected a group of aspiring educators each year, providing them with financial aid, hands-on experience, and direct mentorship from seasoned teachers, including Mr. Thornton himself. For the first time since retiring, Mr. Thornton found himself back in a classroom. But this time, he wasn't teaching literature. He was shaping future teachers. He shared stories from his decades in education, imparted wisdom on how to inspire students, and reminded these young minds that teaching wasn't just a job, it was a calling. 1 year after the foundation launched, the first class of Thornton Fellows graduated from the program. A ceremony was held in Nashville where Taylor, Mr. Thornton, and hundreds of supporters gathered to celebrate. As he stood on the stage, looking out at the young, eager faces in the audience, he realized just how far this journey had taken him. What had started as a simple act of gratitude from a former student had blossomed into a movement that was changing lives. When it was his turn to speak, he stepped up to the microphone, clearing his throat. "I spent my entire career in a classroom," he began, his voice steady but full of emotion. I thought my impact would be measured by the students who walked out of my door each year. But today I see that the work of a teacher doesn't end when they retire. It doesn't end at all." He paused, scanning the crowd. "You are the future of education. You are the ones who will inspire, who will change lives, who will see the potential in students before they see it in themselves. And I want you to remember one thing. Your words have power. Never forget that." The audience erupted into applause, and as Taylor wiped a tear from her eye, she knew this was exactly what she had envisioned. In the years that followed, the Thornton Swift Education Initiative grew beyond their wildest dreams. More schools received funding, more teachers were supported, more students found mentors who believed in them. And as for Mr. Thornton, he never truly retired. He continued to mentor, to guide, to shape the future of education. And every time he stepped into a classroom, whether as a guest speaker or a mentor, he felt that same spark he had felt all those years ago. One day, long after the initiative had become a national movement, he received a letter in the mail. It was from a young teacher in New York, one of the first Thornton Fellows. It read, "Dear Mr. Thornton, I wanted to thank you. Not just for the scholarship, not just for the mentorship, but for showing me what it truly means to be a teacher. Because of you, I walk into my classroom every day knowing that I have the power to change lives just like you did. And just like Taylor, I promise, I will never forget the teacher who believed in me before I believed in myself." Tears welled in his eyes as he folded the letter carefully. His story had come full circle. And yet, somehow, it was just the beginning. As the years went on, the Thornton Swift Education Initiative became more than just a foundation. It became a movement that reshaped the landscape of teaching. Schools that had once struggled with outdated textbooks and insufficient resources now had access to grants that provided not only educational materials, but also technology that helped students engage in learning like never before. Rural communities that had long been forgotten by policymakers now had teachers equipped with the skills and financial support they needed to inspire the next generation. One particularly touching moment came when Mr. Thornton was invited to a small-town high school in Ohio to visit a classroom supported by the initiative. The teacher, a young woman named Emily Dawson, had been one of the first Thornton Fellows. She had struggled through college, working multiple jobs to fund her education until she received a scholarship from the program. Now, she stood in front of a group of bright-eyed students, bringing literature to life in a way that felt strikingly familiar to Mr. Thornton. After the class ended, Emily approached him with a wide smile. "I can't believe you're here," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I wouldn't be here without you." Mr. Thornton smiled, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "No," he said, shaking his head. "You're here because you believed in yourself. I just helped open the door." Moments like these reinforced everything he had ever known about teaching. It wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about planting seeds, about igniting sparks that would one day become flames in the hearts of students who would go on to change the world in ways he could never predict. Meanwhile, Taylor continued using her platform to amplify the message of the initiative. She dedicated a song to the teachers who had shaped her journey, performing it during one of her biggest concerts and bringing Mr. Thornton on stage to a standing ovation from thousands of fans. The moment wasn't about celebrity. It was about honoring the often overlooked heroes who stood in classrooms every day, shaping young minds without expecting anything in return. One evening, as Mr. Thornton sat by the fireplace in his home, flipping through letters from students he had mentored over the years, he realized something profound. His life's work had extended beyond the four walls of his classroom. It had stretched across states, across generations, across lives that he would never even fully know. And as he closed his eyes, he felt something he hadn't expected in retirement, not just satisfaction, but peace. Because in the end, he knew the truth. Teaching was never about a single moment or a single classroom. It was about the ripples that extended outward, touching lives in ways he would never fully comprehend. And thanks to one former student who had once nervously shared her lyrics with him after class, his legacy would live on, not just in the pages of history, but in the hearts of every student and teacher whose path had been changed by his belief in the power of education. Years passed, and the Thornton Swift Education Initiative became one of the most influential education programs in the country. What had started as a simple act of gratitude had transformed into a revolution for teachers, proving that their work mattered far beyond the walls of a single classroom. But for Mr. Thornton, his journey was far from over. Though he had long since retired, his days remained full, traveling to schools, mentoring young teachers, and attending educational conferences where he shared his wisdom with audiences who hung on to every word. His voice had become a powerful advocate for change, urging governments and institutions to invest in education in ways they never had before. Then, one day, an invitation arrived that took him by surprise. The White House. It was an official request for him to attend an event honoring influential educators in the nation. The letter, embossed with the presidential seal, expressed gratitude for his decades of dedication and the impact he had made, not just in the classroom, but through the initiative that now provided scholarships, resources, and support to thousands of educators. When he arrived in Washington, D.C., he was ushered into a grand hall filled with some of the greatest minds in education, as well as policymakers, celebrities, and business leaders who had supported the initiative. Standing in the crowd, dressed in his signature tweed jacket and modest demeanor, he felt overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of what had been built from one small act of kindness. Then, as the ceremony began, a familiar voice echoed through the room. Taylor Swift walked onto the stage, her presence commanding yet warm. The room erupted in applause, but she quickly waved them down, her expression filled with emotion. "I could stand up here and talk about Mr. Thornton all day," she began. "I could tell you about the countless hours he spent encouraging students, about how he made learning feel like a conversation rather than a chore. I could tell you about how, when I was just a kid with a notebook full of lyrics, he made me believe that my words had meaning." She paused, her voice thick with emotion. "But what I really want to say is this. He is proof that teachers change lives in ways they never expect. And tonight, we are here to honor not just him, but every teacher who has ever inspired, encouraged, and believed in their students before they even believed in themselves." The room erupted into applause as Taylor stepped aside, gesturing toward Mr. Thornton. Slowly, he walked onto the stage, his hands trembling slightly as he took in the faces of those standing and clapping for him. He took a deep breath and leaned into the microphone. "I'm just a teacher," he said simply, "and that has been the greatest privilege of my life." The standing ovation lasted for minutes, and as he looked out at the crowd, he realized something undeniable. His story wasn't just his anymore. It belonged to every teacher, every student, and every person who had ever been changed by the power of education. As the applause finally faded, Mr. Thornton stood there, gazing at the sea of faces before him. The moment felt surreal, yet deeply humbling. He had spent his entire career believing that the true reward of teaching lay in the quiet victories. The student who finally grasped a difficult concept, the hesitant writer who found their voice, the struggling child who discovered a passion for learning. He had never sought recognition, never imagined that his influence would extend beyond the walls of his classroom. And yet, here he was, standing on a stage in front of the most powerful figures in the country, being honored for simply doing what he loved. As he stepped down from the stage, Taylor was waiting for him, her eyes shining with pride. She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "You changed my life," she whispered, "and now you've changed so many others." He smiled, his heart full. "I only did what teachers do," he said. "I believed in my students." And in that moment, he understood something profound. His legacy wasn't in awards or recognition, but in the thousands of lives he had touched. And that, more than anything, was the greatest reward of all. As the night drew to a close, Mr. Thornton found himself in a quiet corner of the room, reflecting on the incredible journey that had led him here. The warmth of the evening lingered in the air, but it wasn't the grandeur of the event or the applause that stayed with him. It was the thought of the students he had taught over the years, the ones who had sat in his classroom, wide-eyed and uncertain, searching for direction. He thought about the young girl who had once scribbled lyrics in the margins of her notebook, who had hesitated before sharing them, unsure if her words carried meaning. He thought about how all it had taken was one sentence, "Your words have power," to set her on a path that would change the world. Now, that same student had created something that would change thousands of other lives, a ripple effect that had grown far beyond anything he could have imagined. A hand touched his shoulder. He turned to see Taylor, her expression one of gratitude and quiet understanding. "We did it," she said softly. He smiled, shaking his head. "No," he corrected gently. "You did it. I just helped you believe you could." If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us. What are your thoughts on Taylor Swift surprising her high school teacher with an SUV? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.